Protein is being added to everything these days. Cereal, waffles, even ice cream. And the message is obvious. Our diets must be massively low in protein, right? Did you know the official protein recommendations for the general public haven't changed in almost 100 years? And athletes are told they need double or even triple that amount. So are they right? Are you actually under-eating protein? Or have we all been misled by diet and marketing trends? Today we're breaking down where the protein recommendations came from, what the latest research says, and whether the protein you're eating right now is enough or not even close. Before we talk about the protein needs of athletes, we need to answer one question. Where did the RDA for protein come from? There are two key values used in setting dietary recommendations. The estimated average requirement is the amount that meets the nutrient needs of 50% of healthy individuals within a specific age or sex group. The EAR is used to calculate the RDA. The recommended daily allowance is the EAR plus 2 standard deviations. This covers 97.5% of all adults. When evaluating protein recommendations, ideally the data are presented relative to the size of the person. The recommendations are typically presented as grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day. The foundation of the protein recommendation goes all the way back to the late 1800s. In 1877, a German scientist named Carl van Voigt recommended that a 70-kilogram man should consume 118 grams of protein per day. This protein recommendation equates to about 1.7 grams per kilogram per day. By the early 20th century, Russell Chittenden had collected data in several studies using more sophisticated methods. Based on his data, Chittenden concluded that 1/2 of the 118 grams of protein food called for daily by the ordinary standards is quite sufficient to meet all the real physiologic need of the body. Certainly under the ordinary conditions of life and with most individuals, especially persons not leading an active out-of-door life, even smaller amounts will suffice. His work led to what eventually became the 0.8 grams per kilogram per day standard in 1941. This is still the recommendation for protein intake today. Is this recommendation from 85 years ago still valid? A recent large review by Suzuki and colleagues reanalyzed decades of nitrogen balance data. They found that the overall EAR was about 104.2 milligrams of nitrogen per kilogram per day. This equates to about 0.65 grams of protein per kilogram per day. When you add 2 standard deviations to this, it converts directly to the RDA of 0.82 grams of protein per kilogram per day. In other words, even with up-to-date data and data analysis methods, the original recommendation of 0.8 grams per kilogram per day surprisingly still holds up. But that's only true for sedentary adults. What about for athletes and exercisers? More than half of the body's protein is in skeletal muscle, and athletes create far more protein turnover through exercise. We would expect that they would have greater protein needs. So how much more do they need? Let's start by looking at the most recent recommendations by the governing bodies in the field. The American College of Sports Medicine, Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, and Dietitians of Canada collaborated to create a position stand on the protein needs for athletes. They concluded that 1.2 to 1.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day are needed for endurance and strength-trained athletes, and 1.8 to 2.0 grams per kilogram per day are needed when energy availability is reduced, such as when actively trying to reduce body weight or body fat. These higher protein intakes are needed to support muscle protein synthesis and retention of fat-free mass. The International Association of Athletics Federations is the international governing body for the sport of athletics, which covers track and field, cross-country running, road running, race walking, mountain running, and ultra running. The IAAF is now known as World Athletics. They recommended 1.3 to 1.7 grams per kilogram per day for weight-stable athletes, 1.6 to 2.4 grams per kilogram per day for athletes who wish to achieve effective weight loss, which promotes the retention or even an increase in lean mass. They also stated that there are no risks of kidney damage or poor bone health for intakes up to 2.4 grams per kilogram per day, and that greater than 2.5 grams per kilogram per day offers no adaptive advantages. The International Society of Sport Nutrition's recommendations were slightly higher. They recommended 1.4 to 2.0 grams per kilogram per day is sufficient for most exercising individuals. And there is, quote, novel evidence that greater than 3 grams per kilogram per day may positively affect body composition. There are some slight variations by group, but they all recommend significantly higher intakes than the general recommendation of 0.8 grams per kilogram per day, with a range of 1.2 to 2.0 grams per kilogram per day, depending on training and goals. The evidence that was used to create these recommendations is pretty interesting. Let's take a closer look at some of those studies. One of the most important studies used to create these recommendations for athletes was published back in 1975, and it was a brutal protocol. There were only 12 men in this study, but don't let that fool you. The methodology was extreme. The participants were healthy men in their 20s, weighing between 60 and 70 kilograms. They were all considered sedentary and were not regularly participating in any type of physical activity. We'll see later that this was a very important characteristic. They were all required to stay within the research unit 24 hours a day for over a month. They were fed a diet of a rotation of 8 to 9 different meals with a total caloric intake that was 10% more than their energy expenditure that they measured several times per day. The protein intake for this study was maintained at 1 gram of protein per kilogram of body weight per day. After 2 weeks on the diet to establish a baseline, they began the exercise program, which consisted of 6 20-minute high-intensity cycling intervals each day. They burned a total of 3,516 calories per day through exercise. This exercise routine continued for 20 days. Nitrogen balance was completed every day throughout the study. Researchers collected all urine, feces, and even sweat to measure nitrogen loss. Would you volunteer for this study? This was a tough study. Remember that the participants in this study were not regular exercises. It's such a challenge to get a non-exerciser to stick to an exercise program. Just think about how difficult recruiting for this study must have been, given the intensity of the exercise. The results were very interesting. This figure presents the nitrogen balance data for the entire study. For nitrogen balance, the goal is to be at 0. Positive nitrogen balance means that an excess amount of protein was consumed that was not used. This extra protein was excreted in the person's urine, feces, or sweat. Negative nitrogen balance means that the protein intake was not adequate to meet the protein metabolism requirements. Negative nitrogen balance would mean that muscle growth would likely not occur. In fact, muscle will likely be used as an energy source. Recall that in this study, each person maintained a strict 1 gram of protein per kilogram per day throughout the study. Here we see the nitrogen balance for 10 of the days before the beginning of the exercise program. Notice that on average, the 1 gram per kilogram per day was enough to maintain a slightly positive nitrogen balance, indicating that they were consuming more than enough protein to meet the protein metabolism demands. At day 0, they started the exercise program. 24 hours after they started, every subject was immediately in negative nitrogen balance. This means that once they started the exercise program, 1 gram per kilogram per day was not enough to meet the protein metabolism demands of the 3,500 calories of daily exercise. By day 3, they were all still in negative nitrogen balance. By day 5, nitrogen balance was becoming less negative, and some of the subjects were already in positive nitrogen balance. The upward trend continued. By somewhere around day 11 to 15, the average nitrogen balance was almost at 0, and it was maintained for the rest of the study. Keep in mind that the protein intake was maintained at about 1 gram of protein per kilogram per day throughout the study. The key takeaway points from this study: when beginning an intense exercise program, the protein needs are going to be higher initially. But after about 2 weeks, the body becomes more efficient at using the protein from the diet. So the protein needs decrease once the body has adapted to exercise. The exercise in this study was intense, but we can agree that it was mostly aerobic in nature. Does this same type of protein efficiency response occur during resistance training? A 12-week resistance training study explored whether the same adaptations happen with weightlifting. The subjects were 8 young men who had not regularly exercised for at least 6 months. As we saw in the last study, this is important that they recruited untrained subjects because the protein needs are initially higher in non-exercisers. It was a 12-week training program, 5 days a week. They used a split routine with push, pull, and leg days. Each day they did 4 to 5 different exercises, 3 sets of working up to an intensity of 80 to 85% of the 1 rep max. Sets 1 and 2 were 6 to 10 reps, and the third set was number of reps to failure. The protein intake of this study was maintained at 1.2 grams of protein per kilogram per day. They also followed the diet for 5 days before beginning the study. The rest of the diet was adjusted periodically to ensure that they maintained their body weight. They retested 1 rep max every 4 weeks, and body weight was checked regularly. At the beginning and the end of the study, they measured nitrogen balance from 24-hour urine collection. They measured protein balance using tracer method to assess protein synthesis and breakdown. Body composition was measured using a DEXA, and they measured 1 rep max strength assessments. The authors reported 98% compliance with the training sessions. The results showed significant improvements in strength across every exercise, ranging from 30 to 100%. The body comp results indicated no change in bone mass or body fat mass, but there was a significant increase in muscle mass. So the training program was effective at increasing both strength and muscle mass. The nitrogen balance showed that on average, the 1.2 grams per kilogram per day resulted in positive nitrogen balance before they started the study. After 12 weeks of training, they were significantly more positive. Protein balance was measured using the tracer method. When comparing before and after the exercise program, protein synthesis was reduced and protein breakdown was also reduced. To calculate the net protein balance, protein synthesis minus protein breakdown were calculated. After training, you can see that the net protein balance became significantly more positive. This is what we would expect to see given the increase in muscle mass that occurred in this study. To summarize, 1.2 grams per kilogram per day was more protein than they needed both before beginning the program and after 12 weeks of exercise. The improved nitrogen balance suggests an enhanced protein efficiency of protein metabolism, favoring muscle growth. And the reduction in protein synthesis and protein breakdown indicates a regular downregulation of protein turnover. Their bodies became more efficient at using the same amount of protein. While they did not measure the nitrogen or protein balance during the first couple of weeks of the training program, we can assume that they had been in negative balance initially. But like we saw in the previous study, protein needs were higher early in the resistance training program and were lower once adapted to the activity. When taking these two studies together, protein needs are higher during the first 2 weeks of starting either an endurance or a strength training program. Then they decrease after that. In the case of the Hartman study, 1.2 grams per kilogram per day was much more protein than was needed. For people who are already training consistently, the question becomes, how much protein do they need to consume to stay in nitrogen balance? There really aren't that many high-quality studies that measured nitrogen balance with different protein intakes in individuals who are currently strength training. Here's a good example of one of those studies. In this study, a group of strength-trained athletes who had been strength training for at least 2 months, an age and body weight matched group of sedentary men, each completed 3 different diets for 13 days each, followed by nitrogen balance assessment. The protein content of the 3 different diets was 0.86 grams per kilogram per day, 1.4 grams per kilogram per day, and 2.4 grams per kilogram per day. Other than the protein differences, the overall caloric content of the diets were equal. The results were captured in this figure. Protein intake is on the x-axis, and nitrogen balance is on the y-axis. I'll add a line at the 0 nitrogen balance for a reference point. The dark circles are for the sedentary group, and the open triangles are for the strength-trained athletes. During the 0.86 grams per kilogram per day protein diet, almost all of the sedentary group were already in positive nitrogen balance, indicating that most of the individuals were consuming more than enough protein. However, almost all of the strength-trained athletes were in negative nitrogen balance, indicating that most were not consuming enough protein. During the 1.4 grams per kilogram per day protein diet, all of the sedentary group remained in positive nitrogen balance, and all but one of the strength-trained group were also in positive nitrogen balance. During the 2.4 grams per kilogram per day protein diet, all participants in both groups were in positive nitrogen balance, indicating that they were all consuming more protein than necessary. Using multiple regression, the authors reported that the protein intake to achieve nitrogen balance for the sedentary group was 0.69 grams per kilogram per day, which is very close to the standard RDA of 0.8 grams per kilogram per day. For the strength-trained athletes, the protein intake needed for zero balance was 1.41 grams per kilogram per day. So the 1.4 grams per kilogram per day was pretty close to meeting the protein metabolism of those strength-trained athletes, while 2.4 grams per kilogram per day was much more than they needed. Stuart Phillips did a similar analysis of the limited nitrogen balance studies of strength-trained individuals at different protein intakes. His analysis found that protein intake for zero nitrogen balance was 1.19 grams per kilogram per day. If we add a couple of standard deviations to that to capture more of the population, then that increases to 1.33 grams per kilogram per day. So, in general, the typical strength-trained athlete who consumes between 1.3 and 1.4 grams per kilogram per day will probably be near nitrogen balance. Some have suggested that protein balance studies have a tendency to underestimate the protein requirements. I also agree that it's better to be a little on the positive side of nitrogen balance graph than to be a little on the negative side. To err on the side of caution to be sure that we're consuming enough protein, 1.4 to 1.8 grams per kilogram per day is more than enough protein for most strength-trained exercisers. For endurance athletes, there are even fewer high-quality studies. The few studies that I've found did not find improvements in performance for protein intakes above 1.5 grams per kilogram per day. The timing of protein intake may be more important for endurance athletes, but that topic will take a bit to untangle, so we'll save it for another day. For higher protein intakes, the IAAF reported no adaptive advantages of greater than 2.5 grams per kilogram per day. This was consistent with my review of the literature. The ISSN reported, quote, novel evidence that greater than 3.0 grams per kilogram per day may positively affect body composition. From my review of the research in this area, these studies were typically in obese adults or weight class sports who were on a caloric restrictive diet for weight loss. Their protein intake was very high, but they typically don't report it in grams per kilogram per day in these low-calorie diet, but rather as a percentage of the total macronutrients. As a very general rule of thumb, a well-balanced diet should consist of about 15% protein to maybe as high as 20% protein. The studies in this area typically used an Atkins or ketogenic type diet with protein intakes from 25 to 50% of their total calories. While these diets are generally effective for quick weight loss, athletes must recognize that their performance is likely to decrease due to the lack of sufficient total caloric and carbohydrate intake. For example, this case study of a professional bodybuilder who was cutting weight before competition did a nice job of presenting his exercise performance changes. While his strength relative to his current body weight was unchanged, his absolute strength decreased in every lift. His relative VO2 max was similar, but his absolute VO2 max also decreased. This and other studies attempt to frame the performance changes of these types of studies relative to the new body weight and suggest no change or maybe a slight increase in performance. I don't have a problem with the way that they present this data, but if you're used to a 210 kilogram squat 1 rep max and it's now 180 kilograms, any competitive athlete does not feel like their performance is unchanged. The idea of a high protein diet in these cases is to try to preserve as much muscle as possible. While it does help, the bottom line is that there is going to be some muscle loss with the total weight loss, and you are very likely to be able to lift less absolute weight after weight loss while on a high protein diet. Here's the summary for protein recommendations. For sedentary adults, 0.8 grams per kilogram per day still holds up. For athletes, the sweet spot is closer to 1.4 to 1.8 grams per kilogram per day, which is about double the general recommendation, but far from the megadoses that we see promoted online. And anything past about 2.5 grams per kilogram per day, the evidence suggests that you're not building extra muscle, you're just building more expensive urine. How do these recommendations translate into food selections? While I wouldn't necessarily recommend eating fast food every day, here are a few examples of protein intake of some healthy options from fast food restaurants. I calculated the protein needs for an 85 kilogram individual who is sedentary and for a regular exerciser. I divided that number by 3 to give a rough idea of the amount of protein that you should be targeting for each meal. For the average person, it's very easy to meet the protein recommended daily allowance without even trying. For the exerciser, the protein needs may be a little bit higher, at least initially. As we saw in some of the studies presented earlier, the body actually becomes more efficient with protein metabolism on fewer grams of protein. So beyond the first couple of weeks after starting an exercise program, most will be in positive nitrogen balance when consuming protein on the lower end of the recommended range. As we can see in these examples, exercisers may need a little bit more protein in their daily diet. In my next video, I'll provide some practical guidelines on how to meet these extra protein needs. So as you're walking through the grocery store surrounded by protein-boosted everything, as long as you're eating a balanced diet, you don't need the protein-boosted foods. The science doesn't support these marketing trends. Alright, that's the truth about the protein recommendations. No hype, just science. If you enjoyed this, give this video a thumbs up and consider subscribing. Next time, I'll provide some practical tips and options for athletes to meet their protein needs.